Recording in progress.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, and it is a delight to welcome people who are joining us from all over the world, incredible participants in this event, people viewing this on various platforms. If you're joining us on YouTube or LinkedIn or Twitter or here in the Zoom platform, if you're a World Economic Forum member, a member of Devex, welcome. A big welcome to all of you. And this is a welcome really for those of you who know SDIP, the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership. And for those of you who don't, for whom that name is totally new, this is the annual meeting of that group. And I can assure you it's relevant to everyone. The issues that this organization, that this partnership aim to tackle are really core to the future of the world. And these are issues that I think are well known to all of you who work in the global development community, who work in business, who work in finance, who work in government, and across many sectors. Because we know that we were, before the pandemic, facing massive challenges when it comes to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, or when it comes to the climate crisis. And we have gone through this pandemic. It's not over. It's still going on. And what have we seen? We've seen that inequality has worsened, poverty has worsened, that the challenges have gotten greater than they were before. And I remember back when the Sustainable Development Goals were first being ratified, I was at the UN. I was moderating a session a bit like this one, and one of the speakers was Bill Gates. And we got a question from the audience, just as I hope today we're going to get a lot of questions from this audience. And someone very skeptically said to him, well, you know, the estimates for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals suggest we need new investment of trillions of dollars each year. Isn't this really a pipe dream, an impossibility? And he had a very annoyed look on his face, and he basically said, what about innovation? And that was his entire answer. And really the answer to that question, what about innovation, is this group. It's the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership. That's the core issue this partnership between the World Economic Forum and the OECD aims to tackle, which is we live in a world today where trillions of dollars are earning nothing or even negative returns. People are literally putting their money into assets that return nothing because they say, that seems safer, maybe it seems less risky, at the same moment when countries all over the world in the global south desperately need capital to invest in climate and sustainable infrastructure, to invest in the development of their own people, to invest in the SDGs. And this group is here, and this annual meeting is here to talk about what is happening, what innovations are happening at that intersection of finance and climate and SDGs to actually drive this agenda further. You're going to hear more about the SDIP, about SDIP in just a few moments, but I want to welcome our first speaker, who's one of the co-chairs of the group, to kind of get us started and give us a sense of what we're here today to discuss. So I'd like to welcome Susanna Moorhead to provide some opening remarks. Susanna, I think, is well known to everyone here as the chair of the overseas of the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, which is the group that gathers together donor nations and sets policy around development, a really important role. And Susanna has spent so much of her career at the forefront of these issues in the Global South. It's great to be with you, Susanna. Love to hear your opening thoughts.
Great, thank you, Raj, and a very warm welcome to everybody around the world. I'm in Paris on a beautiful sunny July day. You know, I think I don't want to talk about COVID and the pandemic and the fact that it's thrown the SDGs already into reverse. I think we all know that. I think we've all seen the very frightening figures coming out of the World Bank on at least 110 million more people pushed back into poverty, but also the terrible scenes on our screens, in India, in Ethiopia, in many parts of Latin America, all for slightly different reasons, but I think all driven and made worse by this pandemic. So, what are we going to do about it? That's what I really want to learn about this afternoon and to focus on. I mean, Raj talked about risk and innovation, and I think the first thing to say is that we have all had to rethink our risk appetite over the last 18 months. And I would really push all of you to do that when you're thinking about how to innovate and how to finance this gap for the SDGs that has, of course, been made, I think, deeper and harder by COVID. I mean, in essence, what SDIP tries to do is to bring together public and private finance, but also public and private people and minds and ideas to think creatively about how we are going to get the two pieces working together to come up with sufficient finance. And every time I engage with private sector colleagues, they would sort of say, well, actually, the money's not the problem. There's plenty of money out there. And even in my little piece of the finance world, official development assistance, we did manage to increase ODA last year by nothing like enough. But it's very clear that no matter what we're doing at the moment, that the rising demand in developing countries is not being met by supply. So we've got to innovate, we've got to take risks, and we've got to make sure that divide between the haves and have-nots in the world, whether you think about that in terms of geography, gender, those who are and aren't vaccinated, those who do or don't have enough to eat every night, those who are or aren't employed, those who do or don't have to deal already with the consequences of climate change. We need to think about how we're going to bridge that gap and how we are going to take some of the resources that are out there and get those to the places that they're not currently reaching. So we need a political reset, that's for sure. And I think we're beginning to see a bit of that in the G20, in the G7, in conversations in the United Nations, certainly in my committee here in Paris. But we need to somehow get this onto finance ministers' desks and onto heads of government's desks. And I think to convince the political leaders of the world that we can achieve the 2030 agenda, what we need is to be able to demonstrate to them that we can pay for it, that we can finance it, that we do have the money. We just need to find better ways of using it. So let me just sort of whet your appetite with 4 areas, and I'm mainly here to listen and learn from you. I mean, the first, as Raj touched on, is to innovate, and there's a lot going on. We're looking at SDG bonds, we're looking at debt swaps in the climate space, we're looking at all kinds of ways to finance vaccines, which, remember, themselves were fast-tracked with some very, very innovative public-private partnerships. We're looking at how to de-risk through blended finance, how to use guarantees more, how to get better at impact investing. So there's a lot going on. And in the DAC, we recently published some blended finance principles to try and help those who are doing it to make sure it has the maximum development impact. The second thing is the enabling environment. I mean, we often talk about the need to make it easier for private capital to go into not just emerging markets, but some of the much more difficult ones. to make the business environment more predictable, to tackle bribery and corruption, to make it attractive to invest in some of the hardest to reach markets. And that is absolutely core DAC business. And again, I think we have the most constructive conversations when donors, diplomats, commercial attaches get round the table with business people and pull together the sum total of the market intelligence they have to help invest more. Thirdly, let's make the business case for sustainable development as loudly and clearly as we can. Private investment isn't philanthropy. It's not donor activity. It is what I think increasingly an important segment of the private investment community is looking for. Individuals, corporates, others are looking for sustainable developments and sustainable investments in development. And again, I think we need to work together in the public and private sectors to make a compelling business case, but as I said earlier, also a really compelling political case that this is good for everyone. And I think last but not least, it is the criticality of what is actually happening in partner countries. And there I would draw your attention to the fantastic work done by SDIP on the country financing roadmaps. So two so far in very different contexts, one in St. Lucia, in a small island developing state that is already dealing with the consequences of climate change, and in Ghana, a very different country, but one that has a very, very strong commitment to achieving the SDGs. And what these country roadmaps do in a nutshell is to sit down with all the players and figure out what the most effective way to finance the country's concerned development trajectory is. And what's so important there is that it is the country itself that is in the driving seat. So let me just finish by encouraging you all to, tear up your pre-prepared speeches if you have them, riff off each other. Really, so much of the problem statement is well known. But every time I join SDIP conversations, I come away with, a technical idea or an investment opportunity or just some creative thinking that I hadn't had before. So I hope that we can really use this annual meeting of SDIP to think out of the box and to work out how on earth we are going to finance the SDGs and not let this terrible, terrible pandemic slip through our fingers and increase global inequality. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Susanna. And I think you really did a great job laying out for us all of the key issues that we're going to get into today in much more detail. And I want to bring in Dominic Warre, who is another co-chair of SDIP and a managing director at the World Economic Forum, to kind of dive a little bit deeper, Dominic, into this question of what the private sector is doing, because we're hearing so many commitments around net zero, around sustainability. There's so much talk around ESG. How do you read the moment we're in terms of what business commitments are? Are they real? Are they significant enough? Do they reach the global south, the countries we're here focused on today? What do you think is sort of going on right now?
Thanks, Raj. It's great to be here for the SDIP annual meeting. Thanks for the opportunity. It is real and the numbers are large. It needs to find a way of getting into emerging economies and how that risk is brought down to allow that to happen. That's basically the challenge, which is why SDIP is the app that helps provide that solution. Here's an example of why it's real. There's a funny acronym out there, GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. That is a mobilization ahead of the Glasgow COP, and that has 160 members of the financial services community, asset owners, bankers, and insurers. Together, they represent about $70 trillion of revenue under management, and they are collectively committed to that net zero deployment of capital. So 2030 agenda aligned, particularly in the climate space. It's there and it's primed and it's ready to go. On the other side of the boundary interestingly. We've seen some great movement recently by the World Bank in terms of a new climate strategy. But in terms of the enabling environment, in terms of those balance sheets that can be used from the public sector to bring down risk, to allow that $70 trillion to get into emerging economies, that is one of the hurdles that we need to overcome very quickly. In terms of company,
I was going to say, Dominic, so this issue of risk, I just want to get to this quickly. Is it a perception issue? Is it a real issue where the risks literally are just too high and private sector needs to be de-risked in a way by likes of the World Bank, development finance institutions, government money, taxpayer money from donor nations? Or is there really just a perception issue and the actual risk is much less than these private sector financiers think it is?
That's a super question, Raj. And Susanna, the head of the OECD DAC, kind of nailed it in the conversation that you had with her just earlier. We've spent, since the Financing for Development conference in 2015, I think maybe 5 years to 2020 or so, very much focused on the project, the risk in the project. What's interesting, and you heard from those roadmaps, and they're set out in the brilliant report from the SDIP launched today, is that actually the enabling environment is as critical as the project. So that informal gathering with, for example, the president of Ghana for the country financing roadmap in Ghana, or for the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, which can identify country-led objectives for sustainable infrastructure financing, key obstacles and roadmaps within the country context, and where a combination of public and private can bring down those enabling environment risks and allow the finance to come in at the project level, is the key. And those two financing roadmaps are very, very interesting indeed, in very different contexts from SDIP, one for small island developing states and one for an emerging economy like Ghana, which itself has made a pledge to reduce its reliance on ODA and has, if I'm not mistaken, about 70% of its GDP in Ghana reliant on the private sector, and particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. So that's the kind of the key to unlock is the enabling environment and reducing the kind of policy risk and such in that space.
Of course, Ghana is an interesting example because so much of the reason they're able to potentially reduce their reliance on donors, external donors, is the oil and gas industry, right, and the natural resources there. And it points.
Right. Then take that back, Raj, to what we were just saying earlier about that funny acronym GFANS, and all of that money now being stacked up for net zero investments into the sustainable infrastructure we need for the green energy and such. If you think about Ghana, think about Accra, think about Timor Port, think about the potential across West Africa. Ghana is a very key economy in West Africa for green hydrogen, green ammonia, for the new kinds of fuels the shipping fleets will need. And then think again about where that private money is looking to invest in that new kind of infrastructure. These are the huge opportunities that are there, and the app that is SDIP is really starting to unlock that through those roadmaps for financing, and that's the key, as opposed to project by project alone.
Yeah, I love that point. And tell us a bit more about this in the enabling environment. Presumably, these are very tough issues to solve in the enabling environment. Give us an example what some of those are.
Well, for example, in the St. Lucia roadmap with the Prime Minister, a key issue has been around loss of jobs. With the lack of travel and tourism because of COVID, there's been a huge impact on many small island developing states' economies. St. Lucia's no exception. That's not necessarily a sort of project-orientated investment. There's not necessarily a kind of enterprise that is suddenly going to create jobs. Jobs are created through those enterprises. So the enabling environment itself needs to be conducive to be able to reskill, retrain, and enable people to get into jobs. And that is something that the roadmap in St. Lucia identified, identified a kind of public-private vehicle that can offer up to $12 million for reskilling and upskilling efforts to enable people to be available for the labor for those enterprises that want to invest in St. Lucia. So that's a very kind of credible enabling environment outcome, which then makes the project investment more likely to succeed because there are people who will be invested in for the skills to do that work.
What do you think we need to do to speed this up, right? So this is an issue we've been talking about since Addis Ababa and the Financing for Development Summit. Businesses in some ways seem to be further ahead than governments, moving quickly, making commitments. what can we do to actually, this intersection, as you describe, where public and private money needs to come together, the blended finance space, isn't moving all that quickly from my standpoint. Do you see it moving faster than I am, or do you think there's some opportunity here to unlock it? What does the app of SDIP do to make this move faster?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, Raj, you've been around this space. I have, many people watching this too have been around. I would suggest that most of us feel that kind of, if not now, then when. Seems to be a moment. COVID maybe, and the terrible impacts of COVID have done a number of things. It's created space for many corporations to think about the value to society of what they're bringing, both in terms of maintaining employment, but also how they've been able to provide PPE and other equipment as multilateral fractures have occurred. The very fact that the vaccine development itself was a massive public-private effort, which delivered a suite within 12 or so months, is incredible. Can that momentum be channeled then into delivering on the SDGs 2030? I don't think that there's yet enough urgency about the 2030 agenda across the SDGs as a timeframe. I do think you can sense it in climate. I do think you can sense it in terms of heat waves, droughts, floods, the impact and the tear that that's creating across equality in society. Something must be done. If we can use that increasing sense of urgency to mobilize investment into the sustainable infrastructure that we need, I think we will find that sprint that will maintain itself. A couple of wins start to make all that happen. And the wins in these roadmaps like Garnus and Lucia, the wins of an SDIP that, thank goodness it exists. Imagine if we didn't have it, you'd need to kind of create it really quickly. So it exists. And there's an increasing appetite to use it. I think it's up to us as practitioners in the space, it's up to Devex, it's up to those on the call to really get behind it and say, okay, so where can we pile in, as Susanna was saying, leave that speech behind and get in there and riff off each other and make some of this stuff happen, because we don't have another 10 years after 2030. It's not like, oh, well, 2030's gone, let's look at 2040. We know what the science is telling us, particularly around that climate challenge. It's going to be too late. Yep. So thank goodness you and I and the people on this call are alive right now and have the wherewithal and the smarts and the experience to lean in and get this done. There's no other generational moment like this. It will be too late if we start having this conversation to 2040.
Dominic, Laura, you give us a great call to action to kick off our next panel and to kind of get into this beyond the project level, as you say, thinking big. We have to think big, if not now, when. Exactly as you say. Thank you so much, Dominic, for your co-chairmanship of this initiative and for taking the time to be with us this morning.
Thank you, sir. And we're very, very proud to be a co-chair of SDIP with OECD DAC and all 43 members of it. And we're very much looking forward to leaning in for that sprint and very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let me introduce the panelists that we have for our first panel conversation. It's an incredible group from all over the world. We have Donald Perry Kanak, who's the chairman of Prudential Insurance Growth Markets, based in Hong Kong. We have Mary Rosich, who's the chief data officer at Standard Chartered. And we have Harry Cho, who's the managing director of the head of sustainability and sustainable finance at the Singapore Exchange, based in Singapore. Mary, I don't know where you're located. We haven't had a chance to chat yet, but I know we've got quite an international group here joining on the panel and all over the world. So welcome wherever in the world you are. We want to get into today in this session, kind of what is the next frontier on sustainable finance, right? We heard from Susanna and from Dominic, kind of the lay of the land, where we are, why we need to have this urgency. So what's actually happening? And we want to do that across three areas. So we have Don to talk about the energy transition. We have Mary to talk about data and digital. And we have Harry to get into the climate question and sustainability. So maybe we can start with you, Don, and just hear a bit from you about the energy transition. What are some of the mechanisms that you see happening in emerging and developing countries?
Great, Raj. Thank you. And can you hear me? Is this everything working?
Loud and clear, Don.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, I would say that the biggest and the most urgent climate challenge is energy transition, especially decarbonizing electricity. And the elephant in the room of decarbonizing electricity is coal. Coal-fired electricity is still the world's largest source of carbon emissions, and it accounts for about 30% of total carbon emissions globally. Now, if you live in the US or you live in Europe, you might believe that coal-fired electricity is declining, because it has been declining in those two regions. But excluding the US and Europe, coal is still by far the largest source of electric generation, about 40%, and that number has not been falling much. That's scary because the IPCC projections say that if the world wants to stay under 1.5 degrees warming, coal-fired electricity needs to fall to 9% by 2030. That's right, from about 40 to 9% by 2030. Now, some people say, don't worry, coal plants are old and they'll just retire on their own. I wish that were true, but unfortunately it's not. In Asia, where over 2/3 of the world's coal-fired electrical capacity exists, the average age of coal-fired power plants is only 12 years. So many of those plants have 30 or more years to run. And if those plants run for their expected lifetimes, not only is the IPCC 1.5 degree projection dead on arrival, but it also means that the demand for renewables remains suppressed and unpredictable because renewables can only be added on the margin on growth, and it's not really replacing that base coal capacity. You might think also that the divestment movement, divesting from coal, is going to solve the problem. But unfortunately, the record seems to show that opportunistic investors are willing to step in and buy coal assets, and they're likely to run them for maximum profit, not to retire them early. So it was against that backdrop, and since about the middle of last year, that I started to share this idea of an energy transition mechanism. And that was after about 3 years of talking to a lot of people in the public, private, and civil society sectors. The ETM, the Energy Transition Mechanism, would be a special purpose company or a fund established by any developing country that wants to accelerate its transition to clean power by shortening the lifetime of its coal plants, replacing those on an orderly basis with clean power, and providing affordable power for its citizens. The ETM would be funded by blended finance, which means with assistance from multilateral banks, development finance institutions, and donor governments, and crowd in the private sector. That would enable the ETM to achieve a very low cost of funds. And with a low cost of funds, the ETM can acquire existing coal-fired power plants, but not operate the plants for the full expected lifetime, just long enough to pay back the funders of the mechanism and allow the host country to develop replacement power, clean replacement power. The ETM also, instead of acquiring plants, could actually just pay current owners to simply close them and decommission them early. Either way, the key is an orderly and just transition for power consumers and an equitable transition for affected workers and communities. One of the main benefits of if you could establish an ETM in any country is a lot of the countries today, as was said earlier, are struggling with financial stress from dealing with COVID. And the cash that an ETM would be infusing in by paying the owners to retire those plants or to acquire those plants, that is a boost of cash that can be reinvested in the development of renewable power and upgrading transmission and distribution. The ETM can also help with transfer of technology from developed to developing countries to make that easier. And finally,
go ahead.
Yeah,
finish your last point. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the final thing is just this point about accelerating the demand for renewables. If there's an orderly plan to retire coal, suddenly you're going to see a lot of open space over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, maybe doubling, tripling the amount of renewable demand. And that's going to dramatically change the dynamics of energy transition. So that's the idea.
Very quickly, Don, where does that idea stand? It's a compelling idea, and certainly you make the case for why it's critical we address this. Is the barrier getting countries to sign on? Is it getting the donor countries to provide the public capital to de-risk a bit the private? What's the barrier?
If you'd have asked me that 6 months ago, I would have been fumbling for an answer. But the truth is, it's starting to get traction. The Asian Development Bank is doing a technical assistance project now in several Asian countries. There's been some interest expressed in the energy transition work stream for COP26. We have a couple of speakers later today, Ahmed Saeed from the Asian Development Bank and Sherry Nursalim, who's a special advisor to the Indonesian government on climate change. They're speaking on other subjects, but if they have an opportunity to comment on where they think it stands and the potential for Southeast Asia or for Indonesia in particular, that'd be great. But I do think it's starting to get some serious attention and government recognition.
Yeah, and it does get to this point, Dominic made, that now is a moment in time, right? Countries need fiscal stimulus. We have the pandemic. Maybe this is the moment when you can take something like this ETM and actually bring it to fruition. We're going to come back to it in a second, Don. I want to bring the others into the discussion. So Mary, we can turn to you and your focus on using data to help unlock sustainable finance. Tell us more about that.
Hi, Raj. Thank you. It's great to be here. Yes, I'm passionate about data. I think there's a lot of problems that can be solved using technology and using data. If we all could make better decisions, wouldn't it be easier to solve the problems of tomorrow? At Standard Chartered, we have presence in 60 of the world's most dynamic markets. And our purpose is to drive commerce and prosperity through our unique diversity, and our heritage and values are expressed through our brand promise, which is here for good. But banks have a powerful tool, right, which is financing. And we can use this tool to promote change. And this is very important because we can use new tools such as support microfinance, renewable power, blended finance. But we need to invest in the resources to deliver this enhanced data transparency so we can make these decisions. And there are three key areas that we need to continue to build for this architecture of data to have everything that we need to really drive change. And we need high quality, reliable, and comparable data. We need a harmonized and consistent set of climate disclosure standards. And then we also need a taxonomy where we all agree to the same sets of definitions. There's a long journey, but I believe that we do have what we need today with new technologies and new data science to help us make decisions faster.
Yeah, you see this issue in the ESG space a lot, right? Where people will say this is an ESG investment, but what are the standards? What are the terminology? What do they mean by it? What data sources are they looking at? So if you had to assess sort of where we are in this evolution, Mary, is it that the data is out there and what we need mostly is to come to general terms about organizing what a standard is? Or is disclosure still the issue? There's just not enough data about what companies are doing, what projects are doing, that thus for someone in your shoes to make a decision about a sustainable finance investment.
Yes, disclosure is still an issue, and there's lots of initiatives that are working towards common language and the common set of rules around disclosures. I believe that there's a very good, I'm hopeful that we are putting in place the key foundational elements. One of these is going to be the consistent metrics, labels, and methodologies, standards, and principles. Then the disclosures, and on the other side, these taxonomies that are going to help us blend data and make decisions in real time. But we need to build and we need to invest in this architecture for data to work. And what we see is that companies are not investing in their transition fast enough. And this is something that came out of the recent report that we published with Zeronomics, that shared that we identified that companies intend to transition to net zero by 2050, but they are finding funding as a challenge. They're finding it as an obstacle. So especially carbon intensive industries and emerging markets, which is core to our footprint. That's why this is such an important area for Standard Chartered. Sorry.
Mary, that's a great jumping off point, I think, to bring Harry into the discussion, because this is a lot of what you're working on, right? At Singapore Exchange, thinking about carbon markets, how to use capital markets to drive this transition. Tell us more about what you're working on in that space, Harry.
First of all, I have to say just the quality of sharing by every speaker so far has been so spot on. And so let me then use the example of the Climate Impact X, which is the carbon marketplace and exchange that we're looking to launch with partners. And it was born because there was the right environment for it. So when COVID was first starting out, that there was this sense of, gosh, what do we do now, right? What next? How do we ensure that there is continued growth and we don't lose everything in trying to recover from the pandemic? And so the government of Singapore pulled together what's called Emerging Stronger Task Force. And within that was this group called Alliance for Action. And one segment of that was on sustainability, and it was all about PPP, so the partnership between the public sector and the private sector. And so there were few ideas that were brought to attention. But one of the key things that this task force wanted to enable was actually trying to create, we all know that in the race towards net zero, Donald was talking about this extreme decarbonization. I mean, this is seismic change that the world and the various sectors have to undergo. So how do we enable voluntary carbon markets so that the actors who are not party to Paris Agreement also have a mechanism to continue to decarbonize? So, it was an innovation project that was driven out of partnership. So what CIX is going to be is it is a digital platform, and there's going to be two parts to it. So there is the marketplace. The marketplace is going to be created to service the buyers who are looking for those bespoke projects. So there are many buyers out there already today in the MNC and the corporate world who have a very clear idea of what kind of carbon credits that they want to actually acquire. So that's we're very busy creating right now the enabling technology, the utilization of technology, as Mary was saying, to ensure that there is better verified impact, better transparency, better integrity, and better sort of stamping of quality there as well. So satellite usage, looking at how to use machine learning, how to use lower energy forms of blockchain. These are all in the works, and none of this is driven by any one party. The platform itself is a partnership between DBS Bank, ourselves, Standard Chartered Bank, and Temasek, which is a sovereign wealth fund out of Singapore. And around this are going to be two different pools of groups of experts, if you'd like. One, which is going to be International Advisory Council, formed with NGOs and experts who are going to tell us, advise us, what is high quality? We have an idea what high quality is, but how to continue to drive that as the market evolves. So actually that's one key point. All of us have to be ready for continued evolution, because definition of green and sustainable is constantly going to be changing.
Harry, can I just ask, what is the problem you're trying to solve with this issue? Is it that there are many projects out there that say they are generating carbon credits, but that we don't know for sure to what degree they really are generating those credits, that they're not verifiable or they're not high quality? What do you mean exactly when you say the focus is on understanding the quality level of these projects?
Yeah, so the quality, it can be broken down into a few factors, and then I'll tell you why we're saying high quality. Quality in the carbon credit market would include, is it real? Is it, if it's related to a forest, right? So this is carbon sequestration to a forest, are the trees really there? Is it permanent? Will the trees still be standing there in 30 years' time? Is it additional? Will the trees will the trees be there had it not been for the carbon credit? Is there no leakage? Is there no double counting or claiming? There's new terminologies coming up as well. And for us to claim this as high quality, we want to add the verifiability part with technology, but also focus on verified impact around biodiversity and social impact as well. So that's going to be a distinguishing factor, is a tall order that we're trying to deliver here. Now, the other side, I get so excited when I talk about these things. The other half of the carbon market is actually the exchange, right? So with that, we are looking to create standardized contracts, so financial contracts that enables pools of large buyers, so MNCs and financial institutions, that actually look at standardized contracts across the different quality rating, okay? And this also enables us to pool different projects into these stratas of rating and to be able to purchase it at high volumes, right? So again, we're trying to scale the market. That's the other side of the exciting part about CIX.
So a big bank, a Standard Chartered, rather than buying carbon credits from one specific project, they could buy a portfolio of them. They could buy a security that includes many underlying carbon credits, and at different quality levels might have different pricing in the market. And maybe one day, Don's ETM initiative could consider those carbon credits, and if they're very high quality, as part of the financing mechanism, because he'll be generating them by getting these coal projects offline. Is that basically where you see the direction of this climate impact exchange CIX going, Harry?
Yes, but with a caveat that Donald and his projects must decrease the absolute emissions first. Okay, that is the number one hierarchy order. You have to set the targets. All of us have to set targets. All of us have to make that absolute effort to decrease the emissions. There's no other way around it. However,
right, you could end up with companies in fossil fuel companies or others that are emitting, buying credits to offset it, but they're still emitting. And so, we're not really getting to the point where we're reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. I see Don shaking your head. You want to jump in on this, Don?
Yeah, I was going to say that's I agree completely that anything we do, an energy transition mechanism, a carbon market, has to start with a baseline and a commitment to reduce against that baseline overall. It doesn't do any good to save in one place and put it back somewhere else. So we have to be measuring. And I think that's one of the most critical quality issues for the voluntary markets to solve is to make sure that overall we're not all claiming to be carbon neutral, but when we look around, the carbon is still there. It's that's the most important quality point of all, I think.
Well, and the issue is if these are voluntary markets, you have companies who want to be part of them, joining them. But as you say, there are investors willing to maybe take those offloaded assets, and they might not want to be part of this. So there is a role for government regulation, right, to push companies to need to join these voluntary markets. Mary, what do you think about that?
I think regulators will have the opportunity to drive sustainability on how they look at data and how they measure success. The European Union is planning to develop climate mitigation classification systems, green bond standards. I think, and in China, all listed companies and bond issuers in the country will have disclosures of ESG risk by 2020. As an organization, Standard Chartered has committed to reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2030, which is very, very ambitious. But what's even more ambitious is that we want to reach net zero of our financing by 2050. And that means that as an organization, we must act now and together with companies, with consumers, with governments, and with regulators to drive and to really create sustainable change for this industry.
Yeah, we hear a lot about how renewable energy sources are getting cheaper. Solar panels are getting cheaper, et cetera. Do you think these efforts are raising the prices for extractive industries, carbon emitting industries? Is the cost of capital going up because of the initiatives that banks like yours, Mary, are taking on? Or do you think that's sort of out into the future?
I think we need to look at the future. And, we just announced, Daniel Hanna, who's our head of global sustainable finance, announced that we signed a 280 million euro industry-leading social loan financing for the Ministry of Finance in Ghana. We were talking about Ghana before, and this will help transform the country's road infrastructure. And this is the first social loan to be structured not only in Ghana, but in the whole sub-Saharan Africa. I think there's lots of new opportunities when we look at how can we transform not just organizations, but societies when we start to look at financing with a different set of rules and metrics. And I think data is going to hopefully enable us to do this at scale in the future.
Don, I want to hear from you, and I want to mention we're starting to get some questions in. If others have questions, again, whatever platform you're joining us on, we'd love to hear them. Go ahead, Don.
Just a couple of points. One, I mean, our company as well has signed on to a net zero pledge for 2050 and some short and medium term targets as well of decarbonization. I think one of the most critical, this is one of the reasons we need to roll up our sleeves working with Harry and others in the region, because you can't decarbonize your portfolio if you're operating in markets that themselves aren't decarbonizing. So we have to work public-private cooperation to help with that transition. Otherwise, everybody's, you're swimming against the current. So that's a very important thing. One thing I wanted to mention on Harry's point about quality, I don't know what others are finding, but I think there's a real need for transparency if we're talking about quality in the carbon market. If you're looking to buy projects today, sometimes it's very hard to see how much of that amount that you're contributing, whether it's through a carbon credit or whatever, is actually getting to the ground, to the community itself. and how much is somewhere in the middle between some market makers' cost of purchase and the cost at which they sell. So I just think one thing, if Singapore is going to add quality, would be to figure out how to get that transparency element into the projects.
I will
That's
channel
interesting,
that back,
yeah.
Donald.
That's something you're working
I
on,
will
Harry?
channel that back.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're saying it's not just enough to know is the project, the quality factors Harry mentioned. Is the project real? Is it sustainable? You also want to know what is the actual cost to provide that carbon credit to the end, organization doing the work versus the market maker in the middle. You might be spending a lot on the middleman.
Well, and the project's sustainability will depend a lot on how much of that money is getting to the local community, and carbon sequestration becomes a real source of revenue that, as other things happen in the community, that they'll pay attention and want to keep, whatever it's the trees or whatever. There's mine there. If there's not enough finance there, they'll find other ways to use that land.
So let's say you achieve. Go ahead, Harry.
Sorry, so I was just going to add that indeed. So we've been trying to track the providers of carbon credits who actually provide that clarity, what percentage is going to the ground and who are not. And unfortunately, the market today is very opaque, as you pointed out, Donald. So, creating that transparency means indeed more will go towards the project where it should be going. Yes, people can make profits in between, but the people should know how much is going. So indeed, we have certainly been thinking about this, and it's like input like this, which is going to make a carbon credit that works, that people want. So keep giving us these kind of feedback. We love it.
This conversation you're all having right now gets to one of the questions that came in, which is, do investors really need to sacrifice returns to achieve these kinds of SDG outcomes or climate outcomes? Is that a reality? Basically, if you're you hold a pension, you should accept putting it in ESG, and you're going to get a slightly lower return, but you're going to contribute something to the planet. Or do you think that's artificial, and maybe because of things like opaque pricing and middlemen, you actually could get a market return? Any thoughts about that from any of you?
So,
Mary,
from my point of view, we shouldn't have to sacrifice results because we choose to select ESG or sustainable products. I think this is an imperative. It's not an option anymore. We have a massive impact of climate change in our world. So it's not a matter of whether we choose to do it or not. It's a matter of, are we doing enough? Are we doing everything that we can do? Because there's no going back. There's no plan B. There's no planet B, right? And I think this is really the question. So if I have a choice, I will always make that choice. But do we have the data so we can make those choices? I think this is where it's so important that Climate Impact X, for example, this carbon trading, it's absolutely critical that we continue to invest in this.
Yeah, this gets maybe to another question, which is around the business case that Susanna Moorhead brought up at the beginning of the session today. What is the business case for countries? Don, when you're talking to a country and saying you should transition out of your coal plants that you might have just invested in a decade ago, and they're brand new and shiny and they're working great, what's the business case to get out of it?
The business case today is very compelling. I happen to be chairman of a group called the EU ASEAN Business Council, which represents European industry across the region. And a few years ago, when we talked to countries about this issue, they would say that's the energy minister's problem. But now, as a country that is, corporations across the planet are greening their supply chains. If you can't provide renewable clean power, you don't get that next data center. You don't get that new factory. So in order to be competitive, get the jobs of the future, transfers of technology, and to continue to grow foreign direct investment and the economy, you really need to be making this transition. Otherwise, your neighbor's going to get that investment and you won't as a country, as a leader of a country. I think this consciousness is now very, very central in the countries that we visit in the region. And that's where we now focus, is growing Asia and also Africa.
There was, this country is hardly global south or emerging markets, but I was recently participating in a sustainable debt summit down under in Australia. And there was this really interesting comment where, really in-depth conversation about the Aussie market. And someone actually said, is Australia at the risk of becoming a stranded asset, Australia itself, right? So just like any country or any company or any country, I mean, the way that we've been thinking through this is breaking it down into what do you need to do to future-proof and what do you need to do to build and capture the opportunities? And then where do you need to take leadership to make these happen? And on the future-proofing side, you know, the key is try to get it as concrete and quantitative as possible, and that should not be just done by the sustainability officer. Today, my lunch with CFO was talking about how can we build this into business financial planning. You know, last week it was with the CRO to say, how can your team help me quantify this further? And, you know, on the business side, the questions we get from equity analysts is, what's the revenue contribution? Because they see that there are revenue potential. So build upon that, work throughout with all of the, you know, executive management in your organization to see how do you make a case to future-proof, to invest in future-proofing, and then how do you build and quantify the case for building on the future?
Yeah, that's a provocative point, Harry, the idea that an entire country could become a stranded asset. I mean, we certainly know that countries that are highly oil dependent have been thinking for years about how do we transition. But your point really would extend to many other countries that you know, are in the natural resource extraction business or in the fossil fuel business or dependent on coal for their energy sources. It's a provocative point, and it's good to hear that ministers are starting to take this seriously and understand it. We need to begin wrapping up, and I want to get some final thoughts from all of you. Maybe we can start with you, Mary.
I'd say that the key for success is going to be to work together. And it's going to be companies, consumers, governments, regulators collaborating to develop these sustainable solutions and investing in the infrastructure to bring the data together.
Yeah, the data component is really key, as you've highlighted, Mary, and it does, it feels like one of these infrastructure investments that is always someone else's problem, right? But you need everyone to move forward in this direction. And if you don't, you leave all these gaps, including on things like quality. So appreciate very much your interventions today. Maybe Don, we can go to you.
Urgency. I've been to about 6,000 webinars and climate conferences and discussions over the last decade. In fact, preceding the decade, I went to Copenhagen. And we all leave a meeting thinking, great, that was a great meeting. And that doesn't do anything. So we really, Dominic said it earlier, this may be the last great chance. If we don't do something serious in Glasgow and really make some commitments and provide this money and get countries to do set targets and start working on them, we'll miss the chance. So I would say urgency is the number one focus thing we need to keep in mind. Don't leave a meeting without a do list.
Yeah, no, you're right, Don, and Dominic said that well, that, you know, if not now, when? On the other hand, we're barely able to raise the money for vaccines, right? When there's in the middle of a pandemic. And so you think the short-termism of government, of politics, of some business, you know, how do you get past that and actually take that message of urgency and see something happen? I know that's what SDIP is all about, but I think it would be reasonable for people looking at this from the outside to say, boy, this is a tough challenge. This is not an easy one to generate that urgency.
Well, we see people working harder during this crisis on generating finance in creative ways. Central banks, I mean, look at the amount of liquidity that's been created. So we just have to figure out how to get that level of crisis injected into some of these problems which emerge over a longer period of time.
Yeah,
I think it can be done. I don't think there's a shortage of money. We've just proven that in the last few years. So it's a question of how to get that money. And I think we see, I mean, I can say there's an enormous change in the private sector, and that's come around through pressure, it's come regulation. It's not just, you know, I would say, you know, a philanthropic intent, but the private sector is now taking this very seriously. And I think, I mean, I would throw it back to some of the historical development agencies is to say, okay, you know, what can you do to raise your game on this? And let's get together and move this ball a lot quicker.
Yeah, that's an important call to action. Harry, some final thoughts from you.
Yeah, so totally agree with Donald. You have to take action today. So you have to get started, but know what's your materiality? Where do you have leverage within the systemic picture? Having said that, you must have stamina, because sustainability is a journey. It's not a it's not an end destination. It's going to be a journey. It's going to be a decade-long journey. where you continuously have to invest in your company, yourself, and your people so that you continuously know what is actually sustainable. Now, just a quick comment that we've recently published a paper called Credible Decarbonization and Transition for Corporates in Asia. And it's specifically a paper that ties up many of these things that we're talking about, because there's so many companies out there who are lost. Where do I start? But at every point of your journey, there are key actions you can be taking. So we hope that can be a good guide.
That's great to hear about that resource, Harry. And I want to thank all three of you. I know our audience around the world are at least virtually applauding the three of you for a fantastic conversation. Really helpful to hear what's happening at the forefront of these issues. I don't think it's all encouraging. You know, it's encouraging to hear there are things working and happening. But as you pointed out, Donald, with your statistics around coal, we are far from the end. You know, we are only very, very early still. And it does make you realize how the intersection points here between what governments and regulators need us to do and need to do themselves, with the development agencies who finance some of this need to do, what private business needs to do, banks and financial institutions. Those intersection points are so critical. And I know it's where the three of you are working hard at, and what this organization STIP is all about. So thank you for your insights, your time today. We're going to move on now to the next section of our agenda, but thanks so much.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we now have an exciting launch we're going to hear about from a colleague at the Asian Development Bank, Ahmed Saeed. And really, this is a launch to talk about how you can accelerate sustainable development after the pandemic using SDG bonds. And Ahmed is going to be joining us with some comments now, and then we will move from that into a panel discussion. We'll get some more into the details. So please, over to Ahmed.
On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, I'm delighted to be part of this SDIP annual meeting and wish the World Economic Forum, OECD, and Devex best wishes, both for a productive set of conversations today and for a high-impact path going forward. SDIP is a much-needed platform, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic's impacts being felt across the world. It allows various stakeholders, private and public, to work together towards sustainable development. One thing that has changed in recent years is that our problems have become far more complex. But we also have a much more diverse and capable set of actors working to solve these problems. Coordinating their actions is even more important than ever, and SDIP plays a key role in this process. ADB has supported the SDIP ASEAN Hub since it was launched in 2017, and we signed an agreement with the World Economic Forum in 2019 to further this support. I want to thank Ramesh Subramaniam, Director General of Southeast Asia and co-chair of the Hub, for his leadership in this regard. I'm delighted to launch at this meeting an important knowledge product entitled Accelerating Sustainable Development After COVID-19, the Role of SDG Bonds. This is an outcome of strong collaboration between ADB and SDIP, and the topic, that of mobilizing capital for sustainability, of course lies at the heart of what SDIP aims to do. While ADB estimates that developing Asia will see a healthy economic rebound in 2021 of 7.3%, clearly the effect of the pandemic has been massive, with some regions such as Southeast Asia seeing negative economic growth of 4.4%. I want to highlight three key messages from the publication we're launching today. First, how important it is to remain focused on delivering the SDGs. Second, unlocking flows of finance to the SDGs, and third, the need for innovative finance mechanisms. On the first subject, achieving the SDGs has been made more difficult by the pandemic. The UN's SDG Report 2020 identifies the indicators that will lead to many goals being off track, including an estimated 71 million people expected to be pushed back into extreme poverty in 2020, the first rise in global poverty since 1998. With women and children expected to be among those bearing the heaviest burden of the pandemic. The report also shows worsening impacts of climate change. 2019 is the second warmest year on record, and worsening impacts on ocean acidification and biodiversity loss. The second point, unlocking flows of finance to the SDGs. Delivering on the SDGs, especially on climate change, will require ensuring the right scale of funds flowing to all countries. And we have a problem here, with a massive 26 trillion financing need in just developing Asia alone before 2030, in order to maintain growth, eradicate poverty, and respond to climate change. The financing gap of 459 billion, even before COVID-19, across Asia has worsened due to the economic contractions being felt now, hence the urgent need to mobilize private capital. Risk, country or sector or project-specific risk, has been the main reason for this growing gap, and clearly platforms like STIP have a major role to play in creating the knowledge and capacity for enabling environments and de-risking financing mechanisms that can unlock such flows of capital. ADB's own Cambodia Solar Park project in 2019 was an excellent example of public and private sectors working together. One new initiative that could also make a significant contribution is Fast Infra, or Finance to Accelerate the Sustainable Transition infrastructure. Led by a team of Climate Policy Initiative, HSBC, the International Finance Corporation, OECD, and others, including ADB, under the auspices of President Macron's One Planet Lab, this initiative's aim is to develop a sustainable infrastructure label that could lead to sustainable infrastructure as a deep and liquid asset class. Finally, the need to innovate finance mechanisms such as SDG bonds. Late last year, in 2020, ADB supported the government of Thailand with technical assistance through a facility we manage, the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, or ACGF, to issue one of the first post-pandemic sustainability bonds. It's telling that despite the pandemic, this bond raised around 30 billion Thai baht, about $964 million US, in August 2020, and was oversubscribed 3 times. Clearly, there's appetite in the global financial community for green, social, and sustainability, or GSS, bonds, which adhere to global best practices. In Southeast Asia, estimates suggest a record issuance of GSS bonds of over $12 billion in 2020. But far more will, of course, be needed. So how do we deepen and accelerate this bonds market? That's the key question that this book we are launching today tries to answer. With high perceived risks of new issuers and local government enterprises and agencies seen as a deterrent, the book suggests innovatively structured SDG bonds that can both de-risk investors while also linking acceptable returns over a period to indicators and to performance. Such SDG accelerator bonds, or SAB bonds, have been described in this book. I hope that this new publication and the SDIP platform at large act to spur many more SDG bonds and projects. These can help retrack countries back to the challenge of meeting the SDGs. ADB will certainly continue its support for SDIP in these efforts. Once again, in conclusion, I would like to wish this annual meeting the very best for a successful outcome. Thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank Ahmed Saeed for those comments, and it's interesting to hear how many new knowledge products are coming out from the session today, and his focus on maybe a new kind of financial instrument, a sustainable accelerator bond under the umbrella of sustainable development bonds. Certainly, I think one of the themes we've gotten into a lot today is the need for new instruments that bring in different forms of capital. So very interesting intervention from our colleague at the Asian Development Bank, and appreciate hearing from him. I want to bring in our next panel, which is going to dive deeper on many of the same issues we've been talking about today, really focusing in on the finance is there, the money is there, the word trillions rolls off the tongue nowadays. How do we get some of it where it's needed? And the SDIP has put together a fantastic group to get into this question, including people who come from the government sector as well as from the private sector. So let me just welcome all of them here. Preeti Sinha, who's the Executive Secretary of the UN Capital Development Fund. Nice to see you, Preeti, welcome. We have Kun Duns, who is the Director General for International Partnerships at the European Commission. I think until pretty recently, Kun, it was known as the Director for International Cooperation and Development. For those of you who haven't followed that name change, you are the development group of the EC. We have Zoe Knight, who's the Managing Director and Group Head at the HSBC Center of Sustainable Finance. Nice to see you, Zoe. Thanks for being here. And Sherry Nur Salim, who is the co-founder of United in Diversity and acts as a special advisor on climate to the government of Indonesia. Sherry, nice to see you as well. Welcome, everyone. let's just dive right in. Hopefully you heard some of the prior conversation today as we have talked about this key moment we're in, a climate crisis, an SDG, poverty crisis, and we have these tools, public money, private money, and yet it's not quite there. And so we're hearing about how the SDIP is bringing together the public and the private to find those solutions. And you, of course, wear various hats on this panel as part of that intersection of those public and private entities. So we'd love to hear from you. What is required? What do we need to do to unlock this issue, to get the money where it's actually needed? So much of this investment in the ESG space, in the sustainable finance space, climate space is going to the global north. How do we get it into the emerging and developing countries where it is so desperately needed, where there's a high perception of risk, where trillions maybe doesn't roll off the tongue, where, to use the vernacular, there isn't as much fiscal space? How do we do that? How do we take advantage of this moment and this opportunity? Maybe, Kun, can I start with you?
Yeah, well, happy to start, but I'm afraid I don't have the answer to your question, which is
it's an easy one.
Which is indeed the multi-billion-dollar question, because as you said, I think, and also in the previous session, it was very, very clear. It is somehow very strange to see that there's so much money, let's say, in the richer part of the world, looking for a high return on investment, higher than what they can get in the rich part of the world, that they're driven by ESG standards, by anything that can be low carbon, that we see huge potential basically in emerging economies and in frontier markets. Just look at Africa. I mean, the huge potential on solar, wind, geothermal, sustainable agriculture, it's really massive. Add to that demographic evolution, which normally you would look at and say, hey, that's where the future lies. That's where I want to put my money. That's where I'm really got a return, and it's not happening. So how can you overcome that? And obviously, it's complicated, and a lot of things are needed at the same time. And that's what we're trying to, let's say, contribute to with what we're trying to do. For us, I mean, there's three angles basically we're trying to look at. It's of course the business environment. It's work on the supply side, and it's work on the demand side. And if you look at the let's say the whole environment, the regulatory, macroeconomic, technical barriers that stand in the way, we're trying to take some inspiration from what we're trying to do in Europe on the whole regulatory framework, because I think for us this is absolutely essential, is that regulators need to set clear targets and provide clarity on policy direction. Unless that happens, investors will never go there. And so we need to help our partner countries develop those credible tools, frameworks, and perspective. If you look at what we've been trying to do in Europe to develop that kind of sustainable finance ecosystem, we look at the building blocks. I mean, sustainable finance disclosure regulation, EU taxonomy, corporate sustainability reporting directive, and so on and so on. So there's a wealth of experience we have, and partners do not need to go all the way as we did, but the essentials there really have to be in place. And so building dialogue, cooperation, partnerships between authorities, corporate and financial actors, and social partners to start setting out those frameworks is for us an essential part of the work. The second one. Yeah.
So just quickly on that, Kun, so you run, for those who are not familiar, you're running one of the world's largest development cooperation agencies. And it sounds like a big thrust when you go and meet with your counterpart in a country in the global south would be to say, we want to help you, we want to help fund a change in your regulatory environment, to raise the cost of capital of doing carbon emitting, polluting business, and to reduce it for doing sustainable. That's a big thrust of your agency, you're saying.
No, there are three angles. That's one fundamental part. And without it, we are convinced it will not work. And to be honest, in the dialogue we're having, it's not the easiest message to bring, but it is clearly understood. And when you talk to ministers of finance, when you talk to ministers of the economy, they absolutely understand that there's a real work that needs to be done. The second element really is the supply side. I mean, even those who are interested face actually a very limited, a very small pipeline of high quality, low carbon climate resilient investment projects. And so work on that pipeline is a second element we do. And we accompany that with really, technical assistance that is provided to develop those things. And then the third element for us on which we work is the whole demand side, because obviously, risks remain. And there, with the European Development Finance institutions, we are now mobilizing funding to remove some of what is sometimes a real risk, but very often also perceived risk. And if through the budgets we have, and we can deploy ODA as guarantee. So we've developed a much bigger exposure on innovative financial instruments. The new budget we have has increased our guarantee capacity by 10. So we're now talking about really, almost 60 billion in guarantee capacity. So with that one, we can really play. And we are wanting to roll that out to basically de-risk operations. And that will then remove part of the hesitations on, let's say, the demand side. So for us, it's really work on three pillars. It's demand side, supply side, and then the whole environment.
Thanks for that, Koen. And Preeti, maybe I can bring you into the discussion now. There's an alphabet soup of agencies, in this space, and UNCDF is one of those, and one that you're really pushing to be at the forefront of these issues. Tell us how you're trying to do that with UNCDF. Where are you going to try to find the space to help unlock the private capital that needs to go into these countries? Because I know you're working really with the lowest income countries, the ones that often are most overlooked by private capital.
Thank you, Raj. Great question, and thank you, Koen, for the comments you made. So let me take just 2 seconds to tell you about UN Capital Development Fund, because we are trying to do more. So this was set up in 1966 by UN member states to fund the least of the developing countries. And they gave us these instruments. They gave us grants, technical assistance, loans and guarantees, and now we do blended financing. So we are sort of an agency in the UN which was meant to be a financing agency. So what we are right now, I would say we are a hybrid of a development agency and a development finance agency. So with the grants and TAs, we go in and we seed all those regulatory policies as much as we can in the 46 least developed countries. And these are about 33 are in Africa, a couple in Asia, and then some in Asia Pacific. And we also go in for the last mile. So when we are the development agency, we can take the risk, right? We can go in for the smaller projects, the last mile projects, because it's the grant and TAs work. So sometimes we work in the $0 to $5 million project size as well, but that's sometimes what these economies need. Then we can work on the 5 to 25 million and over 25 million. So I wanted to take maybe four points, and it refers to the earlier panel also. So let's talk about risk perception for these 46 LDCs. And I don't think they're the least attractive countries. I think they're the final frontier of development. So we want to see how we can build new better.
Can you give us a couple of names of these countries, Preeti, just a few, just so people have a sense of what you're talking about?
So in Africa, it would be the Gambia, Chad, Comoros, DRC on the east side. Even some of the big ones are still LDCs, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, for example. So we have a hub in Dakar, which covers the west, and Uganda for the east, and one in Bangkok for Asia Pacific, Fiji as well. So, these countries, I think they're wonderful. We just need to work with them. So risk perception, right? We feel the risk perception is higher than it needs to be. And one of the reasons is there's not enough interaction with global capital markets. So when have the big, asset managers, pension funds spoken to some of these country representations? So we are doing a global roadshow virtually. We've tied up with Jefferies, which is a investment bank in New York. And we're going to try to bring, one by one country ministers or representatives to talk about their country plans. Maybe not specific investments, they can, but more about where they've been in the past, where they want to go. So I'm going to kick that off in July, and then we're going to have the Gambia speak to Jefferies' investor base. So that's one on the risk perception we think will help.
That's a fantastic idea. Everyone's heard of road shows for the latest big IPO, but road shows for, the least developed countries is a fantastic concept, Preeti.
And I think it'll be fascinating. And sometimes I think it's so doable, right? Liberia with 3 million people. We can establish the SDGs, basic standard of living for all. The second one is de-risking. So we talked a lot about de-risking. So again, we're going in there. In Gambia, we've de-risked a solar power project. It's a 10 megawatt solar power project. We put in $9 million as a guarantee. along with UNDP, our sister agency, and that should attract $15 million in private capital. So now here's the question for private capital, and we've got HSBC here perhaps. Would a $9 million guarantee get investors to put in 15 million into the Gambia? Is it enough coverage? And this relates back to Susanna Moorhead's point of OECD earlier, the risk appetite, how much should be the coverage? The first loss, when ODA comes in, which is so precious, what should be the ratio? We have to ask private capital. So that's one. I'll tell you a little bit about Danske Bank bond that has been issued. It's the latest innovation. Because, again, when you have the pension funds and insurance, they need credit rated and liquid assets. And these investments in development are not. So Danske Bank has created an SPV. And for the first time, 2 Swedish pension funds have put in 177 million into this SPV, on Danske Bank's credit ratings, which it is then giving to responsibility in Zurich, which will then invest in sort of the LDC countries on a debt project. So the interest will flow back to Danske and pay off the bonds. So for me, this is the first time we've seen pension funds get linked to that investment. And we all recognize, the risks that need to be covered. And then just to add, CEDA will come in and guarantee the portfolio by 25%, the SME portfolio.
I want to get into all this. So I know you've got a couple more points, Preeti. I'll just ask you to make them quickly so we can bring in Zoe to respond to some of this.
Okay, so domestic local capital markets. So we work on the pipeline. So we really work with the countries trying to get them to give us the pipeline. Ghana, Cambodia, we just do that. And we try to pool some of the projects. We want to pool all the solar projects and create it as a portfolio. So they're not all $5 million projects, but 15, 20. And more to come on that. And lastly, just the blended funds. So we have 3 blended funds we're very proud of. One is for SMEs, which is Bamboo Capital. So it's 50 million first loss and 250 million or 200 million total, the private capital. So it's a 20% ratio of first loss to private capital for SMEs and LDCs. And again, the question is, will we be successful to raise all 250? We've got the 50 million going with Luxembourg and NORAD. So that's one. And then one is on infrastructure, municipal level, 350 million euros with Meridium Capital. So Meridium's out in the market raising funds for LDCs. And the last one is a global coral reef blended fund, 125 million first loss, 375 million private capital. So it's a 25% ratio for coral reefs. So maybe some of those examples, SDIP asked me to be very specific, so I tried to write down all the specific examples.
Really, it's helpful to hear those specifics. It really is, and to have a sense of what's really happening in the market today. Maybe Zoe, you can add to that and tell us a bit about what your work is at HSBC, and what you see as investor appetite. Right, Preeti put that out on the table. This idea that there's a key role for Kun and for her at the UN to de-risk, to make it easier for private capital to come in. Do you see that happening in the spaces that you operate in? Is it happening enough? I'd love to hear your feedback.
Yeah, great. And thanks for that, Raj. So just also going back to your original question about what do we need to do now to get capital funding? Well, we need to do 2 real things. We need to go all out on the things that we know how to do really well. So we all know that the solution to climate change is electrification with clean power. Like, that's a given. But what we're not doing a good job of is getting that capital out to those regional areas where we really need to mobilize renewables the most. How the global finance community can help with that is by connecting those actors that have got high climate ambition into those country networks. And the way to do that through scaling up existing products is through the labeled finance offering. So the likes of green bonds. Now, I know it's quite dull because we've been talking about it for a while, but it really is the way to scale fast. So, the green bond market now has surpassed $1 trillion, and actually there is investor appetite for this stuff. So in the first 6 months of this year, we've issued globally around 75% of the total volume for 2020. So there's investor appetite for looking at these types of financial products. Now, the second point is in terms of what next and how we innovate to get capital where it's needed. And here it's a little bit trickier because we know that we need to provide funding for the transition narrative, and transition in the sense of industry and industrial needs where we're scaling up development. So development infrastructure, schools, hospitals, transport, we're leapfrogging straight to an EV framework rather than a combustion engine framework. And to do that, we need to have very clear pathways so that the financial sector can link the labeled products, so the sustainability linked products, to those sector transition pathways. What HSBC is doing specifically about this is pledged to facilitate 750 billion to $1 trillion over the next decade, specifically for transition. Now, some of that is going to go in kind of the more developed emerging markets, as it were, and some of that is going to be complemented by our philanthropic efforts of climate solutions partnerships, which are acting as catalysts for capital in other different countries that have got needs along the lines of the SDGs. So it sounds very dull to get stuff that we know moving faster. But actually, in terms of getting that volume, that visibility, bringing more people in, let's cookie cut a bit more effectively across the globe so that we can just move on past this.
It doesn't sound dull to me at all, though. I think it's a smart point. You know, we have to productize often, right? When it comes to financial innovation, when it's a product, when it's plain vanilla, it's that much easier. And then the risk perception, as has been discussed all day today, maybe goes down because you say, well, I know what that is. I've made that investment in the past. Is there an opportunity here, Zoe? Maybe this is what you were getting at, but to take the kinds of least developed countries that Preeti is working with and include their projects in a portfolio approach in a green bond that might have developed country assets, you know, least developed country assets, and thereby blending it, you reduce both the risk perception and reality?
Yes, that's exactly right. So what the labeling and transparency piece does is shines a light on the activities that fit into those categories really effectively. So you can be kind of laser focused about it, which helps investors when they're looking at and trading off ideas in different countries, and that will de-risk the opportunity, because it just means that there is a greater sort of sense that as an investor, you really are supporting a credible sustainable development outcome. And that's the hump that we've had to kind of get over, right? It's where does impact really make sense? Like, how is the impact being achieved? And is it additional to what would otherwise already have been done in any case from the private or public sector? And so providing that transparency and kind of funneling system so that everybody's moving in the same direction and can understand the activities, which in turn de-risks them, is helpful for the market as a whole. One last point I would make is on this sustainability linked agenda, that the next wave of that will be in relation to the biodiversity outcomes as well as health and education. And that's where we do need to see some a bit of a step change in how investors are thinking about those outcomes. Climate, you know, we've got a lot of work in train on climate, less so on adaptation and resilience, although it is underway. But the biodiversity area is really quite early on in its journey.
Well, and the underlying point you're making there about trust is so important, right? Because you can see a lot of reporting on ESG, which says that the ESG frameworks and metrics aren't always what investors thought they were getting into, right? They sounded good at the headline level, and they see what they're actually investing in, and they think, is this really sustainable? Is this really environmentally friendly? And if you lose that trust, if you don't see the impact, if investors don't believe in these products, then we might be ruining a new potential opportunity here right at the start. Sherry, I want to get you into the discussion. You advise a major government, a major economy that has to go through this transition, that obviously has a lot of its own domestic finance, but you're in a region with lots of other countries that need international finance. How do you see this picture of getting finance into the places where it is most needed?
Thank you, Raj. And also, I think I really appreciate ASDIP, World Economic Forum, and OECD, who are our strategic partners for our United in Diversity Foundation. I think you just last talked about trust, and our foundation actually vision is building trust for our common future. So I think for us, we have in Indonesia, we have co-founded with the government of Indonesia the Trihita Karana Forum for Sustainable Development. And that was actually around the the World Bank IMF meetings in 2018, we actually partnered with, including SDIP, WAF, OECD, International Chambers of Commerce, UNSCS, and many global partners on this blended finance and innovation for sustainable development and better business, better world. So that event became the largest blended finance event, about mobilizing $10 billion across many spectrums. The Indonesia government also was the first country to launch the SDG Indonesia 1 Blended Finance Fund to support green infrastructure. And in the COVID year, they raised $3 billion, and in the COVID year already implemented $791 million of projects, renewable, solar, and some of also linked to ports and resilience projects. So we believe, we understand that it can actually work and we have seen it work, and it's also TLFF and others that are linked to natural capital that have also successfully crowded in funds. But I think then this idea is, how could we institutionalize this? I think OECD has been, and WAF have both been strategically involved in, I think Kun talked about policy. So I think that Trihita Karana roadmap was launched to look at, the areas of transparency, inclusive markets, impacts, mobilization. And I think there is a alignment now, including with the multilateral DAG and the other private sectors, quite a lot of banks. I think HSBC, many of the banks are part of this initiative. And if you are not, and I don't know whether UNDFC is really it has been fascinating. I hope you're all part of this Trihita Karana platform. Blended finance, I think, was brought into the G20 leaders of communique in the Osaka, and definitely Indonesia as the host of G20 next year will actually try to institutionalize blended finance and innovation. I think the President Jokowi has invited the THK partners to become co-founders in this as a new multilateral. So for an emerging country or in the development world to lead a multilateral that is focused on how to mobilize funding to meet the sustainable development goals. I think OECD talked about maybe $44 billion of blended funds. I think that may not have included some of the Asian funding, but even that is a trickle compared to the multi-trillions. I think there's different range, like 7 trillions or the global annual shortfall. So I think Indonesia, I think we are ready. I think our president and is the honorary patron of the THK Forum. And actually last week, the US Special Climate Envoy, John Kerry, and our coordinating ministers, Luhut and Erlangga, we co-hosted the THK Climate Forum, and we invited diverse sectors, including partners of SDIP, and to propose solutions for climate action that are quite concrete. And we have seen sort of real important outcomes, including the US Treasury endorsement for the energy transition mechanism, which is a massive blended finance that ADB and Don Kanak, the chairman of SDIP, earlier proposed. And I think, THK has been facilitating discussions with the Indonesia PLN, the energy grid. And I think these are sort of, if these do take off, I think these could have significant impact on early coal transition. And I just want to share on Indonesia, some may not realize I think it's the largest archipelagic nation. We have 18,000 islands. Depending on the sea level, it could be more or less. And I think we also actually have the longest shoreline, 108,920 kilometers that wrap around the globe a few times. And the President Jokowi has mentioned at the P4G summit, we have the largest carbon stock in the world. And this is because of the irrecoverable rainforests, the deep peatlands, mangroves, coral reefs, oceans. And so the world needs Indonesia if humanity is to have a chance at this climate crisis. So we are also moving towards launching this regional natural capital carbon and communities marketplace. So in terms of the carbon pricing, in terms of the blended finance platform, in terms of also aligning the region, ASEAN as well as the Pacific Islands. So I think we look forward to the COP to give us, a platform to support these, as well as G20 next year in Bali, and also 2023 ASEAN. Thank you.
Fantastic to hear about all of these initiatives that are taking place, Sherry. And your point about institutionalization, I want to pick up on that and see if others on the panel want to join in on that discussion, because it does feel like we have an architecture globally. We have so many multilateral institutions, bilateral institutions. Some of you represent them. We have many initiatives. Even SDIP could count as one. Almost maybe too many initiatives. It seems like there's every week Devex is reporting about a new initiative that's come forward. Do we have the institutions we need? Is it a question of taking blended finance and making it a higher priority in the existing institutions? Are we missing institutions? How do those of you who lead them think about this? Maybe Kun, do you want to jump in on what you see as this institutionalization key point that Sherry has raised?
Well, I'm not sure whether creating institutions is ever the right answer to the problem. I think we have basically the institutions we need, and it's more about the policy steer provided to those institutions or through those institutions that we will really move the agenda. So personally, I'd be extremely prudent with creating other institutions, other platforms, and so on. We tend to get lost in our line of business in the global architecture and the underlying architectures. It's labyrinthian and it's complicated for us donors, and it's even more complicated, I think, for those who are ultimately or should be on the receiving end of it all, our partner countries.
Go ahead, Preeti.
Okay, I'll just add. Hone, as you just ended the recipient countries, I would like the recipient countries to be the focal point. So let's take a Chad and let Chad tell us what they want. And maybe we need to help them perhaps structure, some of their thinking, and that would be capacity building. But I would say in the institution side, it's building bridges more than new institutions. So the bridges between, we famously know the figures, the 150 billion of the ODA and like the 400 trillion of private money that exists in the world. So, your guarantee facility, Cone, the 60 million, the billion would be great. And such instruments that could build bridges between the two. Thanks.
Just to build on that point, and both of them actually. So I totally agree that we have the institutions in place, and it is about the bridge building. I think we're getting to a stage now where we've had the sort of theoretical backing of how blended finance is going to work. Now it's about the practical ask and explicitness of what really needs to be unlocked to get that going. And by that, I mean, for instance, if we have real economy explicit targets on how to reduce emissions, so perhaps demand side signals for a certain product that can be a responsibly labeled product or service, or for instance, companies want to look at their supply chains or and whatever it might be, but an explicit target that the government can really anchor itself behind, that really helps with the speeding up the finance flow. Because what we've seen for several years are kind of bigger picture narratives around, well, we really need carbon pricing. We do really need carbon pricing, but we really need to be explicit in terms of actually how do you operationalize that concept. And some countries have managed to do it, and we know we have trading schemes and what have you, and that's moving forward, but things aren't moving forward quick enough. So if we can unlock those nuggets of precision that are country relevant, and Preeti, I think, sort of honed in on that a bit, that country relevance, and showcasing that to a broader audience, that will really unlock the capital flows, I think, and help with the blended argument.
Shuri, I think you might have wanted to jump in on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I do think there are a lot of institutions, but for a multilateral to be in a developing part of the world or in an emerging part of the world, there are not that many. And perhaps maybe we should question, maybe it has not worked all these years because they were not institutionalized in the host countries, which really need the fundings. So I think I would encourage, I think if our president is keen to invite the world and collaborate and co-create this institution of blended finance and innovation, and engaging with partners who have been already part of this platform. I think with the World Bank, IMF, OECD, World Economic Forum, and all these other strategic partners, I think many countries have also been supportive of these, and I think the policy around the Trihita Karana roadmap and Trihita Karana platform has already been ongoing since the 2018 World Bank IMF meetings. So I think this is something that it is something perhaps the idea is to create 6 action areas, how to learn from the mobilization. And Ibu Mari Pangestu, who actually was the co-founder of the THK when she was still a Minister of Trade, that was during the SBY time, but now she's at the World Bank. And so the idea is collaborating on co-creating. So we do not need a lot of people. We actually work with our partners. So partners who are strong in policy making, let's say the OECD has been leading that. So we work with them. And then those partners who are strong in the capacity building aspects, and including, we just had a call with MAS, or they could be governments or institutions who want to support like awareness for training bankers how to structure blended finance. We are developing programs with Convergence to raise awareness, and also call to action for family offices, philanthropy, apart from the DAG and multilaterals. So there has to be targeted approach, and even by sector. I think we are looking also at how to approach these different sectors, how to create marketplaces, and how to develop the technology platform, the data, the matrix. I think that's the tough one. I think there's so many different, whether it's the natural capital side, whether it's the energy side, especially if you have, the voluntary markets, you have the ETS, we are trying to look at how to align the region. So we have to have cap and trade system. So we are, hosting, I think with the help of a lot of the partners, including EU and many countries around the world, the US, the UK, and China, Australia, many countries around the world have been part of that co-creation process. So I think that it is time to let the emerging country and developing country to host this and to get the world to support this co-creation. Thank you.
Yeah, Shuri, I feel like we're getting to the nub of at least one of the big challenges here, right? Which is that the private sector capital, much of it is in places like Europe, maybe earning negative returns, trillions of dollars earning negative returns potentially. You've got the development capital, organizations that are members of the DAC, right? Also wealthy donor countries in the global north. And a lot of the work that needs to be done and the policies that need to be written have to be led by the countries in the global south. They have to lead it. They have to own it. And so this dynamic creates these gaps that maybe we're beginning to get into together as a group. And how do you actually ensure that the policy on the ground is connected to what private sector investors want and what development agencies want to contribute to. How do you stitch all of that together and institutionalize it, to use your words? How do you make this not just one-off projects, but a larger scale initiative with urgency, to use some of the comments from previous panels? So maybe with that as backdrop, I'd love to just open it up and see where the conversation goes. Kun, did you want to add something to this?
No, it's one of the things we've been, that we've been looking into in many places, but the latest, most interesting process I found was the whole preparatory process leading to the Summit on Financing African Economies, which the French President Macron hosted in May, and which was preceded by almost 6 months of work in working groups, very intense, as Sherry said, a real example of co-creation, where we had European experts, African experts of top level, and then increasingly also other G7 experts working together to look precisely at this. So the whole agenda was driven by our partners, but very clearly co-created with those representatives of where the money is. I very much think that it's inescapable to go to a level of granularity, and there I agree with Preeti, maybe because least developed countries are also a sizable part of my portfolio. Luckily, not the only one. I have the lower middle income and the upper middle income countries as well. But ultimately, whichever way you turn it, you always end up with a huge investment, and a difficult one that needs to be made by the countries themselves. That's also why we precisely, and that's maybe a slight distinction with Preeti, why we are much more comfortable not just dealing with LDCs, because since we work on project pipelines, we find that ultimately it's much more useful, much more, let's say, beneficial if you can bring pipelines of LDCs together with those of lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries. We work with investment windows, and we see that partners react much better if they can come up with a portfolio that covers high-risk countries with low-risk countries. Our return on investment in what we get, the leveraging effect on our guarantees is much higher if we do that. And precisely by having upper middle income countries, we manage also to push them towards LDCs where otherwise they would not go. But at the end of the day, to come back to your question, the main work really needs to be done within and by the partner countries themselves.
Yeah, and maybe there's an opportunity, Preet, that you can jump in as well on bringing together some of these instruments. So imagining, a UN CDF investing in a low, least developed country, and that becomes part of the same investment window that the EC is investing in. Because a lot of what we're getting at here is the need to scale this. And I think Zoe was saying, we both need to kind of come up with plain vanilla products like the green bonds, which might sound boring, and also make sure that the ultimate unit economics makes sense, that we actually have precision into the data, and getting those two things right is so key. Go ahead, Preeti.
Sure. So maybe two large points. First, our mandate says work largely but not exclusively with the LDCs. But we feel that it's a good group for us to focus on, and there are other UN partners that could look at the mix, and then we step in with the financial products to help them. So for example, UNDP, etc. So we do things without, in Kenya, in Morocco as well. So it's more how to get the financial instruments to work for these countries. But what I would suggest would be maybe to go to Malawi or go to a Gambia, and maybe I'm just brainstorming a country 2030 strategy, development plan or something, a very concrete plan. And here, let me bring in our partners who are hosting us today, SDIP, there's the Ground Up project. We work on the pipeline. I'm sure, multilaterals and EU work, but let's drive it at the country level so that all the partners come in, and let's make a plan. And then I'm sure there'll be enough funding, but also some kind of guidance and capacity building as well. So I would say country investment pipelines, country 2030 strategy. Let's go to Malawi, let's go to Gambia. Over to you.
Zoe?
Can I just picking up on that country investment pipelines? It's just such a great point. And going forward, we've had a couple of years now where countries have been submitting their nationally determined contributions into the UN as part of the framework for climate. Now we're getting to a point whereby everybody's asking for the investment roadmap that goes with that country plan. And that provides the signal, right? The NDC is the signal of what the country wants to do. Going back to this point, Preeti, I think you made earlier about let's ask countries what they want. Well, they're putting out plans of what they can do to address climate in particular, but actually what finance needs to do a better job of, and I think is working on it, is translate that into an investable roadmap, because then we can scale in both sides, the public-private, get more effective blending systems. And I don't think that it's a lack of lack of awareness that we need to do that. I think there's also a capacity issue. Actually, there aren't that many people in this space that can really focus on translating the emissions pathway into the real economy pathway that needs funding. And so there's a bit of a capacity building to do, which is happening. It's just that it's at scale, the scale required is maybe not as fast as we would like. But that translation exercise, I think for sure, is the next issue to focus on over the next 5 years or so.
Well, what I hear as well from others, and maybe we got a bit of this from Don, is that the official agencies, we have a couple represented here today, and not to pick on them, but them and many others tend to move at a slower pace than private sector. They have other requirements, compliance requirements. They have to bring in government, and the private sector might say, why can't we move quicker? We need them to de-risk this and to create this instrument. But is that something you see, Zoe, as well, coming from a private sector perspective?
I think it depends where you are and which teams you're working with, but yeah, for sure there are sort of speed issues which can come from purely sort of the human angle, right? Like we can't all be totally energized running at full speed 24/7, and there's just an element of needing to sort of keep up with the speed of the people that or the groups that you're working with. And whilst it's imperative that we collaborate and partner, as we're all talking about, that partnering with anybody outside of your organization does slow things down. COVID in many ways has meant that we've managed to do some things quicker. Clearly, we don't want that situation, but hopefully we can learn from the connectivity that we've built up with kind of overseas partners and maybe try and use some of that to move a bit quicker.
Yeah, I've heard this from people who work in some of the multilateral development banks, for example, that, hey, we've learned during COVID, we can work faster than we ever thought we could. We need to somehow maintain that urgency. Obviously, you're right, there are human limits to it, but we need to maintain it. I do want to welcome our audience. If you have questions, bring them into us. I know we have people following us along from around the world on different platforms. I'll try to weave them into the discussion in the final minutes that we have. Kun, maybe I can go again back to you. We haven't heard from you in a little while. What are your thoughts just to consider, continue the conversation?
No, well, I just want to pick up on another point you just referred to. I mean, the speed, but then especially the front loading. And I think that's really still something where we should look at. I mean, we've got ODA, which is let's say a relatively certain source of funding, even if most, I mean, we have the luxury of having a 7-year multi-annual financial frameworks. Most donors work on a yearly basis, but still there is a certainty about what's going to come over the next couple of years. And one of the real questions is, can we not use that certainty of grant funding being available in a certain way that allows it actually to leverage it and front load a number of loans, private sector funds, and so on, that otherwise would not move. And for me, this is a real topic on which we should work more urgently. I see a number of real avenues that can be developed. We're thinking about it. We're not yet there.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of what was, the innovation that was hugely impactful in the global health space around advanced market commitments.
Exactly.
Right. The idea that donors would say, we are going to buy a certain amount of vaccine if it gets developed, and that moved the market. And you're saying maybe we can do that with ODA as well in other sectors, in transport, in sustainable infrastructure.
That's it. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's, sorry to jump in, but that was the sort of the essence of what we're getting to, right? It's creating the demand and the supply and the certainty. So that you kind of need them all in parallel. But if you think of how we're going to develop cities and people's needs in a way that limits temperature rises, it's what we can try and do now is use the cluster effect that cities and industry provides us to create that demand and supply bubble or supply effect. So if you think about the role of hydrogen and how hydrogen is going to plug in as a solution, to get that market for it going and to get the investment flows going, you kind of need 6 or 7 different end markets for the product in the same spot. And so that degree of collaboration and partnership hasn't really been the norm before, but it will be the norm going forward, because that's how you de-risk and that's how you create the market and that's how you get that sort of responsible demand and supply. So you need all of these nuggets, but we also need the global frameworks to sort of help pull it all together.
Yep. Yeah, we have a question in from Don, or a comment really from Don Kanek from Prudential, who's one of our panelists before, on this point, saying, do we need every DFI and multilateral development bank working in every country? Does it add too much complexity, too many voices, slowing things down to coordinate all this? Why can't we pool and focus? And I guess it gets to your point, Zoe, that we do need this collaboration if we want to unlock markets. We can't have every development agency and MDB kind of off doing their own thing. Dominic talked about not thinking about the project, but thinking about the enabling environment. Preeti is talking about thinking about country level investment strategies. Sounds like that's a bit of a theme coming out of the discussion today. What do you think, Preeti?
Totally, and I would echo Kon. I'm trying to set up a capital markets for development team. So I would turn the ask to the private sector. So, at the UN, we have a global investors sustainable development, 30 members. I want each member to offer a product which suits them. So for example, I think what Kon's referring to is the IFM bond, which was done, which was the only kind of capital market innovation, I think, in the sense, the big one. So maybe we could just ask our colleagues who have great depth on capital markets, which I would say the development side may not have, that tell us what will it take, and we'll step in, I'll try to help with the guarantees, etc. Thanks.
Well, maybe all we need, to Zoe's point, is just more green bonds. Maybe that's just taking taking an instrument that's tried and true and working these other ideas into something that is more plain vanilla.
If that's the demand, that's it. Then that's what they know. They know better, because they're seeing the capital markets every day. Thanks.
Sherry?
I think on the Don's point, I cannot agree more. I think we need more alignment and collaboration, and we have no time. So I think what Don has done on the energy transition mechanism, I think and he brought ADB in to work on it. I'm very happy to see sort of the US government has thrown its weight behind, but if there's more to just align, and then I think we can, we can do a lot more and faster, and sort of we can work by country, and then, we can support, let's say 50% of the coal plants to have early retirement, that would be at scale. So we need to have that kind of solutions. And I think Indonesia, we have the Sri Mulyani, who was voted the finance ministers for climate as the co-chair. And so I think we were the first to launch the green bond in Asia. The green Sukuk bond has been, and now we are about to launch the SDG bond. I think that we need all these solutions. I think it's still a major gap to meet the 41% that Indonesia is looking at for the NDC by 2030 reduction. So I think we need a lot more support in many different fields, both technology, finance, and capacity building. And I fully agree on the capacity building side. We really need to go down to, for example, UID, we work a lot on systems and mindset shift behavior, working with youth, working with indigenous communities, working in a very remote across working. And I think we bring sectors, cross sectors mindsets together, and then if we see that actually the Indonesia also has this social forestry law. Indonesia actually has the largest diverse ethnic groups. So apart from the natural and the biodiversity being, I think one of the most important to protect, I think that there's also a lot we can learn from the stewards who are the indigenous communities. And I think the social forestry law and aspects of that are something that needs to be continued to be supported. And I think technology and platforms that enable to bridge the digital divide that can bring the poverty alleviation faster. I think there are already models that has worked in China and different parts of the developing world that we can also learn from and replicate.
Thank you, Cherie. And I want to thank the entire panel. We've unfortunately run out of time, but I think it was a really rich conversation. And I know people who are following this along are virtually applauding all of you, as am I, for a rich conversation. I think we could put so much on the table. What I come away with in part, and we had a skeptical question at the end we didn't get a chance to get to, but saying, so we just create country roadmaps and the private investments will come? Is it going to be that easy? I think maybe that was the intent of the question. I read it skeptically. And I think it's fair to be skeptical, right? We do have all these institutions. We have so many agencies involved, so much private capital sitting on the sidelines. And, what does it take, to use, Dominic's point earlier in the discussion today? If not now, when? What does it take to see this go? But I really applaud all of you, the work you're doing to try to get us there. And I think we had a rich discussion about what's actually happening today. It's an issue we care a lot about at Devex and are covering every day as well. And I want to thank all of you who've been a part of this today and turn it over now, if I can, to another person who's very involved in SDIP, and that is a member of the executive committee at the World Economic Forum, Sean DeClean. And Sean, maybe you can close us out with your final thoughts.
Great, and thanks Raj, and thank you to Devex for joining efforts today with the Forum and OECD in this SDIP annual meeting. And thank you for your wonderful moderation today. I mean, just sitting and listening to this. I mean, often you listen to a series of panels, and I'm sure everyone listening will really feel that they've gone on a journey and that this has been a real dialogue. And it wasn't about. I think you did throw the script out a bit and tear that up and really sort of work with each other in this. So fantastic. Thanks to all the speakers for doing that, for the spirit of engagement in the way that you've done this and what you brought to the conversation today, because this has been a very real conversation. Don't forget to download the SDIP annual report, and particularly ADB's publication, the Accelerating Sustainable Development After COVID-19, which was launched today. And congratulations to the SDIP, ASEAN Hub, and particularly ADB for having combined efforts on a mechanism that can really help mobilize the financing that's required for the SDGs. I mean, as Raj, I was asked to summarize, which there's no way I can do something like this in like 10 seconds. But I mean, there were just a couple of things that stood out for me today. I mean, Susanna right up front talked about the urgent need to bridge the gap between financing and SDG, and that we have to put innovation at the heart of this. We have to take some risks, and platforms like SDIP really play to that. Dominic, as you said, talked about if not now, then when? And how do we really accelerate that? And I think Don Canuck that urgency, and the key to that urgency, and not thinking about the projects but the enabling environment, and not to leave this meeting without a to-do list. And I hope people really have a to-do list after today. And we had some great sort of things about the role of data here and just how critical this is, and the need for data science to complement that, and then how we're going to leverage this. Harry Cho talking about the materials that we're going to need to leverage this, and the stamina that's going to be required. I thought the final panel now, just some really interesting conversation there around the role of recipient countries really taking the lead. I really admire what's been done with like the Ghana and St. Lucia financing roadmaps, where these have been really country-led. And so how do you do that? And Zoe Knight at the end there was talking about let's move away. We know the theoretical of how to blend finance, but what are those practical actions at the country level that are going to unlock that? And both Kun and Priti talked about the fact that you need that policy to support the smarter collaboration at the country level. And just listening to Sherry Nursalam, I mean, the role that a country like Indonesia can play. Sherry, you said the world needs Indonesia and Indonesia needs the world, and the sort of leadership that Indonesia can bring to this. And what I really liked was the point there that you said that you're going into the G20 presidency. And then you've got the ASEAN presidency, and how do you use these critical upcoming moments, COP26, et cetera, to create a real cadence of short-term targeted actions that build towards this comprehensive change, to build these marketplace for sustainable development outcomes. So, just really dynamic, and thank you. And
Sean, you've been on such a great role. I didn't want to interrupt you, but if it's easy, you've got your camera cover on. Maybe would love to see your face before we say goodbye.
It's a Friday afternoon. It had to happen once during the week.
I haven't seen you, I think, since maybe the last time we were together in Davos. So it's partly just a point of personal privilege to get to see you here. But you did a fantastic job summarizing what is not an easy conversation to summarize. And I agree. I think a broad theme that came out is the idea that we work in a sector that's very project oriented. And what we're talking about here are larger scale market dynamics, building platforms, institutions, and that's a different muscle maybe than the way many agencies are set up. And if we don't fix that, if we don't have the market dynamics right, if we don't have, to Kun's point, thinking about advanced market commitments, front loading, thinking in terms of markets, if we don't think in those ways, we won't get these different sectors together. So I thought you summarized it beautifully, and I think it's such a key moment in time for us all to be here. It's been a real honor for me and for Devex to help to host today's event. And I want to thank you and everyone involved, and thanks to our audience for being a part of it. Stay tuned for more like this coming forward in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raj. Tremendous job.
Thank you. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you.